Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Ready Flyte, which is a knowledge exchange and impact event organised, well, in collaboration with Susan Morrison by the School of History of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. I hope you, ladies and gentlemen, have a good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh my word, there are people sitting at the back there hiding. I think they're from Merchiston being posh. So let's try again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, my name is Susan Morrison. I don't use the microphone. I am a Glaswegian. I do not need it. I am a Glaswegian mother. I can make my voice heard across the aisles of Sainsbury's and shout at someone else's child. Now, we are here tonight at Ready Flyte. It's an amazing event. We will have a wonderful paper from a fantastic young academic to begin with. We're hoping to have some poetry later, then we're going to have an interval, and then we're going to have an excerpt from the original Flyting of Dunbar and Kennedy. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we will be having a modern Flyting. Ooh. That is the right noise. The thing is that when we have that modern Flyting, and even when we have the ancient Flyting, there's a very strong possibility that we will ask you to judge who was the winner. I have to warn you, there is nothing angrier than a loser poet. All of a sudden, words like covfefe might get used. Bad twittering may occur. Something will go wrong, I suspect. However, that's not until after the interval, which is fine. So, it's important to remember what the Flyting actually was. It's important to remember where it came from the court of James IV, definitely, undeniably, Scotland's best king. Oh yes. Hey. Bad day at the office at Flodden, I'll give you that. However, I think he was an amazing king. He was an incredible king. His court was a Renaissance jewel. There were ambassadors from, at any given time, 9 European courts were at his court. Now, you don't send an ambassador just to go and look at your gems, okay? So these people felt that James was important. He was a tremendous patron of the arts, of the sciences. He was a really lively, intellectual Renaissance king. He was responsible for building the biggest warship in Europe at the time, the Great Michael, 1,000 tons, 300 guns. This was a Death Star, which was to go to sea to smash castles. That was its job. Okay? He took that out. Henry VIII, Henry goes insane. He has the Great Harry built in riposte to this, still not as big. Then he has alterations made to the Mary Rose, which probably led to her sinking. So really this man influences history throughout Europe without even realising it. And at his court he has poets, he has musicians from all over Europe who come to sing and to speak and to perform at the court of the Scottish king. When the Flyting is performed between these two great Makars, Dunbar and Kennedy, there's massive excitement at the court. News of this competition spreads throughout Europe and spreads down to the Tudor court, where, as you can imagine, Henry does not take that well. You have basically what you've got is a kind of Tudor temper tantrum where he runs around the court screaming that he has to have one too! Does this guy sound like anyone we know today? He's orange, he's fat, and there's a lot of wives in the cupboard there. Henry demands Flyting. He has a court poet. His name is Skelton. I'm really sorry, but if you ever read any of Skelton's poetry, you're going, B-League. He's not in the same standard as Dunbar and Kennedy, but Henry doesn't actually have another poet. So they have to go wandering around the court eventually and go, I will take that one. What are you doing? Write a poem. Now, you. I don't care, move. And so they do, and apparently that attempt at the Flyting at the Tudor court was so bad, we can find no record of it. Or the other guy. So that is how influential, or was it? Because it vanished. Strange. Scottish art form, we would get to slag each other off poetically. It seems to have disappeared. It's very sad. I think we should bring it back. Hello, Ruth Davidson. So, Ruth Davidson and Kezia Dugdale, what do we think? It all disappeared. It all disappeared. It's a flower of the Scots language. It should be taught in schools, apart from one tiny detail, which we'll come to later on in the evening. But before we go any further now, I think it's time that we handed you over to our fabulous academic. All of this evening has risen out of the work of our fabulous speaker, who has actually you've not come down from Aberdeen, have you, darling? No, because you'd never go back, would you? Liz Elliott, who's written a remarkable paper which is addressing the flyting and its role in community. So this evening we begin by Liz addressing us and taking us through her thoughts on the flyting. With any luck we should be joined by our poet later, and then we go for the interval. But ladies and gentlemen, please can I have a huge welcome for Liz. Thank you.
Thanks. As Susan mentioned, this is an event inspired by a poem written at the turn of the 16th century, so a flyting between William Dunbar and Walter Kennedy. Flyting was a familiar pursuit in early modern Scotland, and it's one that suggests both the kind of exchange that we find in the poem, where we find Dunbar and Kennedy exchanging increasingly acrimonious and outrageous insults, taking in everything from the quality of their poetry to their ability to control their bowels. Out with poetry, flyting was also associated with other kinds of argument. Flyting is also a criminal offence in early modern Scotland. It's like breach of the peace. And people who are charged with flyting might find themselves sentenced to public punishments like the pillory or the cucking stool. And both poetic and criminal forms of flyting are linked with verbal conflict or argument. So it might seem strange then that I'm going to argue that poems like Dunbar's and Kennedy's flyting have had an important part to play in shaping the idea of collective identities, in bringing communities together across time. Dunbar and Kennedy's flyting draws personal and cultural conflicts into a pattern that works to establish the idea of inclusive identity, an inclusive identity that's capable of sustaining diverse voices and ideas. My sense of the part that the flyting plays in shaping collective identities in early modern Scotland, and the very kind invitation to speak to you today, comes out of my involvement with the History of Distributed Cognition project that's hosted by the University of Edinburgh at the moment. And the organiser of tonight's event, Dr. Boesler Zarnecki, is the project facilitator. I'd like to thank him for bringing me on board for this event, which promises to give us a sense of how dynamic and meaningful flyting was for its original audiences, and how meaningful it still might be for us today. Theories of distributed cognition are a relatively new way of looking at how thinking happens. And they're even newer to me, as the project that introduced me to these ideas is a collaboration between humanities and cognitive science. And as somebody who was brought in from the humanities end, I'm hoping that the cognitive scientists will make noises of dissent if I don't manage to define this entirely accurately. One of the key things that theories of distributed cognition hold in common is that they approach thinking as a process that doesn't take place completely within the boundaries of skull and skin. It doesn't just take place within the brain. So these are theories that look at how thought processes are bound up with particular physical, social, and cultural environments. It's the idea that human beings use resources that they find in their environment to think, and the nature of resources that are available to you and the way that you use those resources, that impacts on the nature of the thought process that comes out of this. So we might think, for example, about some of the recent research that suggests that students who take notes with pen and paper remember the information that they're collecting very differently to information that is recorded with computers or tablets, for instance. Or we might think about another classic study in the field of distributed cognition, which is Edwin Hutchins' Cognition in the Wild, which looks at how Navy personnel's task of navigation is shaped by the particular environment of the bridge on a Navy ship. So I want to argue that the flyting between Dunbar and Kennedy reflects and makes use of the way that thought processes are bound up with particular physical, social, and cultural environments in early modern Scotland. And this is what researchers in distributed cognition would call the cognitive ecology of early modern Scotland. So the flyting is a collaborative piece of writing, and there's a lot that we don't know about the circumstances in which it was written. But it seems to have started off as a challenge between a group of poets connected with the court of James IV. Alongside Kennedy and Dunbar, 2 other poets were involved, Sir John the Ross and Quintin. And different parts of the poem were written and traded between Dunbar and Kennedy. The Flyting may also have been performed at court, and we know that a later verse battle between Alexander Montgomery and Sir Patrick Hume of Polwart that took place at the court of James VI seems to have been performed. So this earlier Flyting may also have been performed. It's also possible that the Flyting between Dunbar and Kennedy was posted in public places for passers-by to read. Martin Luther's nailing of his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg is just one of the better-known examples of a really popular way of circulating information in the early modern period. And we know that Edinburgh's Market Cross, which at the time stood northeast of St Giles, is a place where documents like this were quite often posted so that people could read them and could read them to other people. And the Market Cross has got a starring role in the Flyting between Dunbar and Kennedy. The exchange of insults in the form of poetry that we find in the Flyting is one that's been compared to what you find in modern battle rap. So, and there are also some similarities in the context of this too. This kind of poetry is something that helps the poets who are involved in producing it to establish a reputation, to stake a claim to being the best at what they do. And we know that the early 16th century Scottish court was a place of intense rivalry between courtiers who were competing with one another for positions and for power. Poetry wasn't a way to make a living at the court in itself, but it could be a way of getting noticed. So it might help you to win the king's favour or to elbow out a rival. Dunbar wrote a satirical poem about the Abbot of Tongland, and that's an example of this kind of poetry. It's poetry that establishes your place against a rival. The poem about the Abbot of Tongland ridicules a man called John Damien, who was either French or Italian, and the king was funding Damien's experiments in alchemy. So Dunbar's poem is one that's taking aim at a rival and at an expensive interest that was taking royal funds away from what Dunbar considered to be more deserving causes, like Dunbar. And if poetry wasn't a professional pursuit for Dunbar, it seems to have been key to his self-image. He calls himself Dunbar the Maker. And the competitive atmosphere that we find at the court of James IV, it's been considered to be an important factor in the emergence of individualism. The court's an environment where you're under pressure to distinguish yourself from the crowd. And we might understand the contest that we find in the Flyting as one way that Dunbar and Kennedy could do that. However, the comparison with battle rap also suggests that the overt hostility that we find in this kind of exchange is somewhat misleading. Work that's been done on battle rap suggests that it's actually much more constructive than it is divisive. Comparing the Flyting to hip-hop, Christy Mitchell and Caitlin Flynn stress the respect that present-day MCs have for one another and for one another's work. So the competitive format of battle rap is one that helps to raise the profile of everybody involved and the profile of the genre itself. So it's framed as conflict, but we might think about it as a kind of collaboration. And we can make a similar claim for the Flyting. So for example, whatever Dunbar says in the poem, he elsewhere calls Walter Kennedy good master. And we might see their poetry as coming out of a similar atmosphere of mutual respect. Although I know Susan's got a slightly different attitude to this, so we might hear more about that later. And this is where I want to turn back to cognitive science to push this sense of Flyting as collaboration a little bit further. So recent work in embodied cognition points to the ways in which sharing activities with a partner or partners, the ways in which those kinds of shared activity impact on people's perceptions of themselves and of the limits of their bodies even. So experiments in which participants had to collaborate to carry out a task had an interesting effect on people's self-image. these experiments shifted participants' sense of how their bodily movements related to the bodily movements of a partner. And the researchers involved with these projects have speculated that this kind of shift in people's self-perception is also involved in other kinds of collective activity. So activities where people get together and do the same thing at the same time, like marching, dancing, things like singing the national anthem, that these are all activities that have a cohesive effect. So they promote cooperation, they promote trust, they can even promote compassion. They're activities that change people's perceptions of themselves and of the ways that they connect with other people. Experiments in cognitive science suggests that the kinds of cohesive effect that arise from these shared activities, that they're stronger where people from cultural backgrounds that emphasize collectivism rather than individualism. So the modern day global north, like Scotland, where people tend to live in nuclear families and they tend to have private rooms that are either occupied by individuals or by couples rather than by larger groups, those are environments that tend to favour individualism rather than what we might have found in the pre-modern era, where people are much more likely to have much less in the way of private domestic space. They're much more interdependent in the ways that they live and experience themselves. So if even the apparent rivalries of modern forms like battle rap are actually collaborative and constructive, if they're forms that make people who are involved in the scene more cohesive as a group, we can expect the effects of collaborations like this to be even more dramatic, even stronger in environments like early modern Scotland, where people are much more used to thinking of themselves as part of a collective. The collective experience that's evoked by the flyting is also not limited to the actual collaborative production of the poem itself. Events within the poem are mapped onto the city of Edinburgh in ways that remind readers from Edinburgh of the shared physical space that they inhabit, and of how the urban environment gives a collective structure to the experience of people who live in the city, who share that space. Dunbar claims that Kennedy has defiled the market cross by treading mud onto it with his dirty boots. And Dunbar imagines Kennedy being chased down the Cannon Gate by schoolboys and dogs and being pelted with clods of earth. And Kennedy shoots back with an invitation that depends on his audience's understanding, on a shared knowledge that the market cross is a place where you might perform public acts of penitence by court order. And here Kennedy wants Dunbar to admit that he slandered him. He says, "Come to the cross on your knees and make a cry. Confess thy crime, hold Kennedy the king." And the effect of all of this referencing of places in Edinburgh would be even more intense if the poem really was written in instalments and posted in places like the Market Cross while it's being written. But in any case, the poem is evoking Edinburgh in ways that would cause Edinburgh readers to think about themselves as members of a distinctive community, as people who share this urban space. And when it does that, the Flyting is making use of early modern people's own insight into what we call distributed cognition. Early modern writing about memory recognises that human beings find it a lot easier to process information that's been organised in terms of location. So it's easier for you to remember your way home than to remember, say, abstract mathematical equations, because those things are spatially located and you're used to moving through them. So arts of memory that are produced in the Middle Ages and the early modern period typically advise people to visualise a series of places. And these can be real places or imaginary places. You might have heard the term memory palace, and this is exactly the kind of thing that's involved here. So people are imagining backgrounds where you can arrange and store information that you want to retrieve. And the use of Edinburgh that we find within the Flyting is one that brings into play the natural and the learned function of places for memory. It's one that cues readers to think in terms of their collective experience and that would fix the content of the poem in the minds of the readers. The kind of collective experience that the Flyting cues is one that accents, as I've said, a shared experience of Edinburgh, and it's one that tends to accentuate a shared experience of the court, since both Dunbar and Kennedy are people who are associated with the court. But it's also evoking a national experience. One of the central points that Dunbar and Kennedy are arguing about in the Flyting is Scottish identity. Kennedy was from Carrick, which is a region of Scotland that at the time was Gaelic speaking. And Dunbar insults Gaelic as an uncivilised and impoverished language. Kennedy comes back with the claim that Gaelic should be all true Scottish men is laid, that it should be the tongue of all true Scotsmen. And he links this identification of Gaelic with a popular myth that was going around at the time. And this is a myth that claimed that both Ireland and Scotland had been founded by a princess, Princess Scota, who travelled from Egypt to Scotland with her people. And this is a myth that fueled Scottish resistance to English attempts to lay claim to the Scottish throne. It's one that suggested that Scotland had a history as an independent country. Now, the language of the Flyting, which is entirely composed in what both of the poets would have called English or English, the language of the poem undermines Kennedy's claim that Gaelic should be the true language of Scottish identity, because the poem itself is privileging the kind of Anglophone culture that was associated with the Lowlands and with the Scottish court. However, a more important point for us is that the structure of the Flyting as an argument is one that works to hold competing ideas about Scottish identity in tension, without trying to resolve them one way or another. So unlike many narratives about Scottish identity, which attempt to homogenise cultures and treat them as something fixed, the structure of an unresolved argument that we find in the Flyting evokes a collective experience of Scottish identity as a dynamic relationship rather than something fixed and constant. So the Flyting works as a reminder of how we might think about nation and national identity inclusively rather than exclusively. And I think that this is one of the aspects of this poem that made it so popular, both with its early modern audiences and across time. The Flyting is a poem that highlights the nation as a space of possibility in ways that we can draw in our own present experience and in our sense of what community, the idea of community might mean to us now. Thank you.
Yes, I think Liz and I have a slight disagreement there because I think they couldn't stand beside each other. But there we go. I'm just wondering, is there by any chance a J.L. Williams in the house? Hello, darling. Were you delayed?
I was stuck at work, unfortunately. But
You
I'm
were
here.
stuck at work. You tell me who that is, and I'll go across and deal with them for you. This is absolutely wonderful news because now joining on the stage is a fantastic poet from J.L. Williams. Thank you. You came to join us. Big round of applause. Thank you.
I have made it along, which is exciting, and I'm not an expert on flyting, and I was trying to think about what poems might be appropriate to read, and I was looking for poems with insults in them, or poems that I suppose I was thinking about poems that represent conflict in some way, where I'm arguing a couple sides even within one poem. And the other thing I had on my mind a lot is that we're certainly living in a time of conflict in so many ways, as we've seen very recently. So I'll just grab one of them. I'm dead tired. I'm dying of shame. Donald Trump is my evil stepfather. Fuck you, fake daddy. You smell of sewage in spite of your Dubai airport aftershave. Here I am, stiff as a board, fresh as a 50th time today, fuck. My balls weigh a ton, my heart is a dumbbell, my pickup lines old as the hills. Stop copying me. I've turned from the future. My eyeballs are glazed with gold. My grill is gone tarnished. My Starbucks are aching. My ancient snake-shaped landform still remembers where the moon rises in winter, where the sun sets in summer. And her mouth is wide as America. Her teeth are sharp as God's accountants. And we're going down, down, down the gullet of history until we come out clean. Clean as the picked, clean bones of the last human corpse on earth. Thank you. And I wasn't really planning on reading this poem, but it just crossed my mind hearing, I'm sorry I missed the beginning, but some of your beautiful piece there, that this one might be interesting to bring into the room. It's called History Like the Rhine, and I wrote it after a wonderful trip to Linlithgow Castle. And it begins with a quote from Samuel Lucas from Secularia, or Surveys on the Mainstream of History, 1862. As we said, history, like the Rhine, passes through a castellated region. And like that of the river, this stratum begins and ends suddenly. The way you licked my leg was how a man would lick. I bought you, thus I had every right to free you. My hand is broken because I built every castle history lapped, that damn river whose silver veins seem the skin of the world. Between the turrets, I carefully cut as a child with an automatic saw was the space in which my whole life would take place. It's not about dreams, it's about the way I lick. Baby, you forget, this jazz quartet doesn't know how to end the song. Ezra walked from castle to castle in the footsteps of the ancient bards. Later in the birdcage, in a Pisan piazza, he cried, "The words, the birds." There is a poem translated from the Scottish to Italian in which the bird species changed. From the hoof of the fountain unicorn in the courtyard of the palace in Linlithgow, I stare at the wall as if my eyes are butterflies pinned to green baize. J'aime ailleurs, ever in bondage. Belle à vous seul, beautiful to you alone. That's what the bosses say, says the sign. My hand a piece of silk in the burn, your tongue sliding up the inside of my leg, the fire raging in a hearth big enough to cradle 20 able-bodied men. Between my thighs, that unspeakable crystal you dreamed in this life or the next. The time of castles was also my time, but this time is also my time. J'aime ailleurs, belle vous seul. The words flow over ma langue. I'll just do a couple more, if that's okay. I just thought I'd read just a couple short poems from this little book, which was a kind of book of 3 poets, and one of the themes in it was the theme of war. And this is called There Isn't a Way to Say This. I'm sorry I can't be more explicit. There are, presumably, easier ways to say this. I wonder if, finally, it's avoidance and obfuscation. Honestly, how would you express it? What happens in the act? I read about it. The images undo what inside should be left done. But it's neither mine to describe nor to end. It is what words point to but cannot be. Life and death. Life and death. Milatum mater. My mother is a holy entity. She rises as smoke from a gutted fire, scratching her wrinkled belly and the soft skin beneath her low-hanging breasts. Body I birthed from as a ball from a cannon. Darkness does not perturb my mother, not her thinning hair or crumbling molars. The work she's done has made her satisfied the enemy will not forget our name. She has nursed death's stillborns like a sick sow. We, her children, dig holes for a living, call them graves or garbage pits or trenches. People die, generations, forests, hope. Mother would be proud of us, so we don't worry ourselves with the particulars. When I am tucked under the stained blanket and the wind and dust bombs are very close, I close my eyes and try to remember what it was like to be inside of her, cowering in the bunker of her womb. And this is a poem called Armistice, which I thought it's kind of about that moment when two enemies of almost equal power they find a moment of peace because of their exhaustion. Armistice. Through my telescope, I can see you on your boat, looking at me on my boat through your telescope. Behind me, the mouth of the cave, the high sea licking green, weed-coated lips. Behind you, the fins of whales, the receding horizon, a brazen globe of sun. It's enough, this engagement, the susurrus of the waves. And I'll maybe just finish, finish with one last poem. This is my new book called After Economy, which just launched recently, so it's nice to get a chance to read a couple poems from it. And I'll finish with this poem called Arcadia, Texas, before we get on to all the exciting things to come this evening. And thank you for listening. The wheat is waving in the jukebox. Young boys, your father's a pharmacologist, a professional, young cowboys. He's built a manufacturing plant. Get your shotguns ready, your engines revved up. The police cows are wailing. There is a God-fearing horizon, and every body is on the stoop of Daddy's kitchen saloon. Mama's dressed like a raven. She's packed her valise with a flume. It is suggested she exercise at least 3 pints a day. Religious desert, pour a blood carpet. Mademoiselle has crystal breath at noon. The president's in the belfry, the smoke is in his eyes. He's bombed again like yesterday, when both his feet went in his pants at once. Succinct Madonna, how long have we been up? Your hips are rounding with child, your breasts are bearing flag. It would be immoral to burn you. So stumble fields and dance, this is our heyday. O great stretched middle of method loom. Placate for the horn drifting through the morning. It is the bull who kneels down first, sings. Hallelujah. Dies.
JL Williams. And can we learn what the JL stands for? Is it deeply embarrassing?
It is not embarrassing at all. It's just boring. It's Jennifer Lynn.
I like Jennifer Lynn. How do we feel about Jennifer Lynn? Thank you. That was wonderful, because you can't have an event about flyting without poetry, without today's poetry. And also, strangely opposite, that there should be an American or North American accent with us this evening. Now, we are going to have a short break where you can go up the stairs to the bar, you can go outside and put there with a cigarette if you want, in fact you can go to the toilet, and then we're going to come back and we shall have our 2 flightings together, and we hope that you enjoy them. So first, a huge round of applause for our first 2 contributors.